I'm Kevin Mims with the Invading Sea, a Florida-wide media collaborative that reports on climate change in the state. As part of that effort, we started The Business of Climate Change, a weekly interview with businessmen and women whose companies are either affected by the warming climate or address climate challenges. Today's conversation is with Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk, director of the University of Miami's Master of Urban Design program and the Malcolm Matheson Distinguished Professor of Architecture. Elizabeth is also one of the founders of DPZ CoDesign, an international architecture, landscape architecture, interior design, and urban design firm headquartered in Miami. Liz, thanks for talking with us today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for asking me to be with you.
So Liz, you've been working and designing in Miami for decades and have taught at the University of Miami since the 1970s. What kind of climate-related changes have you witnessed during that time?
Well, I think probably most of us who've been around that long have seen many changes in the natural environment. I think it's very clear that the water levels look different in the canals or wherever we might be encountering them. Perhaps that's the power of suggestion. I don't know about that. But certainly I think some erratic weather contributes to that. And, I think it does need to be acknowledged that the power of suggestion and climate change is very strong, and that sometimes much is being ascribed to it that may not be occurring. But I do think everyone down here by now is aware that we have something to contend with. And, the measurements of the 10 inches in the last century and the predictions of acceleration of change are all kind of information that we're learning how to deal with.
Liz, how has climate change and sea level rise affected the way architects approach design in coastal communities?
Well, I think until recently, and by the way, I would say that most of us became aware in the last decade that this was going to be something to contend with. It's not that the knowledge didn't exist before, but I would say probably many of us were just not aware of it. And I would say one of the people who brought it to our attention first was Harvey Reuven, with some of the committees and task forces that he set up to address it. Now, I participated in one of those, but it took even, I think, more than those beginnings before the architects began to realize that perhaps the kind of levels, the floor elevations that we were designing to according to the regulations maybe would not be adequate, even in the short or midterm. And of course, we know that those are about to, the official elevations, FEMA's design elevations are going to be changing in the next year or so. And already I think most architects are working to those. You might hear the term freeboard sometimes used, and that refers to really something the architects started asking the municipalities to do, which is enable the zoning codes to allow for some extra height so that you could make a taller ground floor or a taller first floor that could accommodate being raised for increasing flooding in the future. And so many codes already have that kind of freeboard flexibility in them.
Well, that leads right into my next question then. Liz, have building codes and design standards kept up with the changing climate?
They're starting to. First of all, I think it's important to understand there are two aspects of responding to climate change. And notice the word responding or response rather than solution. And one is to try to reduce our effect on the climate, reduce the emissions. And so building design response to reducing impact on the natural environment, on the climate, reducing emissions is what we've already for a long time called sustainable design, or it's about sustainability. I think that's a concept that many people understand. And, use less, reuse, recycle, all of those things, make your own energy, net zero, all of that. That's mitigation. On the other hand is adaptation, which is responding to the impacts of climate change. So if we were all building if all buildings were net zero right now, and so were our automobiles, it would take 30 years for the change to level off. The scientists will tell you that. So the impacts will continue. And so we might expect, no matter how much we try, that we're still going to be dealing with additional heat, additional flooding, maybe storm intensity, and so on. So, and the codes are really just beginning to deal with that. Freeboard, which I mentioned, is one of those things. But we probably need to look at the location, zoning codes, zoning districts, and how we're dealing with the specific areas that are likely to be flooded. And I presume we're going to be doing that in the near future. And Miami Beach is already, I think, set a good example in that sense.
Liz, what makes a particular design more resilient or less resilient?
Well, yes, and you're right. Resilient, I attach sustainability to mitigation, and resilience can be attached to adaptation. And so it's really about being able to withstand the stresses of the impacts, which have also been identified as dual, chronic stresses and catastrophic. And so the chronic stress of just the groundwater rising because of sea level rise that we could see, and the kind of flooding of water backflowing as we used to see in Miami Beach, is one kind of thing to deal with. And then storm surge and the kind of catastrophic winds that a hurricane brings are a different kind of need a different kind of response. So I think we have to be ready for both of those things, and they may be the same kind of response in building, or for the flooding of a storm surge, you may have a different kind of response than you would for a chronic everyday flooding. So I'm sorry, I'm not being specific enough on that, but I think also not only of buildings, but of the public spaces, our streets, and street and public space networks. And so the response to the chronic stresses of flooding might be some depaving, making pavements permeable and giving room, giving percolation more space. The response to the surge might be to, in fact, either allow the water in, and try to get it out quickly with pumps, or we've seen a very interesting proposal from the Army Corps of Engineers to build a wall around downtown Miami, which I think is not a great idea. Once the water gets past that wall, it doesn't have a way of getting out. So there are other ways to try to address that.
Got it. So Liz, what should designers and planners be doing differently?
I think, some designers and planners are already with the program, so to speak, but I do think we should always be designing for the long term. If we don't want to be continuing to create emissions through the waste of repeatedly rebuilding, taking down a building and putting up a new one every 20 or 30 years, whatever the life of its mortgage value is, one of the things we should be doing is building for the long term, and imagining that we want to use resources wisely. And in that case, that we need to be prepared in an adaptive way for the resilience that's going to be required as the situation continues to change. So, I think that's an obvious approach. And then there might be the argument that, well, maybe we should be picking up and leaving at a certain point. It costs money to be that resilient. Maybe we should be building temporarily and understand that there's a short life in some areas. It's always a kind of geographic determination. It's not one size fits the whole region. And in that case, if it is a kind of a short-term approach, then I think in both cases, we need to think about how do we discard or clean up after the use. That's something nobody, really very little thought is being given to. And so whether it's short-term or long-term, part of the scenarios that we need to be playing out, because you really need to kind of play these things out to understand how they might happen. And you'll never get it right the first time out. It's really a kind of design process. But we do need to be thinking about what is that end game of not just how do we get to the end of some financial aspect of the built environment, but also what do we do? How do we pay for cleaning it up afterwards? We have natural resources underneath our buildings here that could help pay for that, but I don't think we've yet really come to terms with that.
Liz, thank you for your time. We appreciate it.
Well, thank you for willing to listen.